In December 2023, China released a document. Not a press release, not a diplomatic communique, not the kind of carefully worded public statement that governments issue when they want to say something without saying anything. It was a technical blueprint, a 50-page architectural and engineering framework distributed through the China National Space Administration, written in the dry, specific language of people who are not theorizing but planning. People who have already decided what they are building and are now working out the order of operations. The document described a permanent crewed lunar base, not a temporary outpost, not a research station of the kind the United States placed on Antarctica in the 1950s Spartan, seasonal, maintained at minimum viable capacity, a permanent, self-sustaining, nuclear-powered installation on the surface of the Moon, capable of housing an indefinite rotating crew, conducting research across multiple scientific disciplines, and the detail that caused the rooms to go quiet in Washington, Brussels and Tokyo when the translation arrived, establishing sovereign territorial infrastructure on the lunar South Pole. Sovereign territorial infrastructure. On the Moon, China has been accused of many things in its rapidly accelerating space program, of ambition, of opacity, of moving faster than its public communications suggest. But in that December document, there was no ambiguity, no hedging, no diplomatic softening of what was being described. What was being described was a claim, not a scientific expedition, not a collaborative research endeavor. A physical, permanent, resource-extracting, strategically positioned claim on a piece of the Moon that the entire international community has, for 60 years, agreed belongs to no one. And the reason the rooms went quiet is not simply that China is building on the Moon. The United States is building on the Moon. The European Space Agency is building on the Moon. 14 nations have signed the Artemis Accords, committing to a framework of cooperative lunar exploration centered on American leadership. The reason the rooms went quiet is what China is building, where it is building it, why that specific location, on that specific timeline, with that specific combination of capabilities, nuclear power, robotic construction, resource extraction, and permanent crewed presence represents something that goes beyond scientific exploration in ways that the existing legal framework governing outer space was never designed to handle. This is the story of what China is building on the Moon, what the technology behind it actually does, what the location means strategically, what the legal framework governing it says, and what it cannot say, and what the next 20 years of lunar activity will determine not just about who controls the Moon, but about what kind of species we become when we leave the planet that made us. To understand what China is building and why it matters, you need to understand one fact about the Moon that changes the strategic calculus of everything happening there right now. Water ice. Not metaphorical water, not trace hydration in mineral lattices. Actual water ice, billions of tons of it, confirmed by multiple orbital missions and the 2009 L-Cross impactor experiment, locked in permanently shadowed craters at the lunar South Pole, where temperatures hover around -250 degrees Celsius, and the sun has not touched the crater floors for billions of years. The lunar South Pole is geologically unique in the solar system. The Moon's axial tilt is only about 1.5 degrees nearly perfectly upright, compared to Earth's 23.5-degree tilt. At the South Pole, certain crater rims are in nearly permanent sunlight, providing continuous solar power generation capability, and the crater floors directly below those sun-kissed rims plunge into permanent shadow, permanent cold, permanent preservation of whatever volatile materials accumulated there over the Moon's 4-billion-year history. What accumulated was water, delivered by comets and asteroids over billions of years, sublimated and redeposited, migrating to the cold traps of the permanently shadowed regions where it could not escape. The LC-ROSS mission confirmed the presence of water ice at the South Pole in 2009, India's Chandrayaan. One mission mapped its distribution from orbit. NASA's Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter has spent 15 years characterizing the extent and concentration of polar ice deposits in extraordinary detail. The estimates of total water ice at the lunar South Pole range from hundreds of millions to several billion tons. The concentration in the richest deposits approaches pure ice, not trace amounts in soil, but layers of nearly solid water ice beneath a thin layer of regolith. Why does this matter so profoundly? Because water is rocket propellant. Specifically, water can be electrolyzed, split into hydrogen and oxygen by electrical current, and those components are among the most energetically powerful rocket propellants known. Liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen, burned together, produce the specific impulse that powered the space shuttle main engines. They are the propellant of choice for high-performance upper stages across multiple rocket programs worldwide. A lunar base capable of extracting, processing and storing water ice from South Pole deposits and converting it to liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen is not just a scientific outpost, it is a gas station. A refueling depot positioned at the top of the Moon's gravity well, at the closest body to Earth in the solar system, capable of supplying propellant for missions going deeper into the solar system without having to carry that propellant up from Earth's much deeper gravity well. The economics of this are transformative. Launching propellant from Earth to lunar orbit costs approximately $10,000 per kilogram at current launch prices. Producing that same propellant from lunar ice, at whatever the extraction and processing cost turns out to be, is almost certainly cheaper by an order of magnitude or more. A lunar propellant depot makes missions to Mars, to the asteroid belt, to the outer solar system dramatically cheaper, not marginally, not incrementally, but by factors that change what is possible. This is why the South Pole is not just scientifically interesting, it is strategically decisive. Whoever establishes a permanent operational resource-extracting presence at the lunar South Pole first controls something that is not quite a port, but functions like one. A location that every future cislunar and deep space mission will have a reason to care about. Both the United States and China understand this with complete clarity. Both programs are targeting the South Pole. Both are racing, not acknowledging the race publicly in those terms, using the language of exploration and scientific cooperation, but racing. And China is closer than most people in the Western space community are comfortable saying out loud. The name China has given its lunar program is the International Lunar Research Station, ILRS. The name is deliberate. Every word in it is doing diplomatic work. International signals that China is not pursuing a unilateral program. It is inviting partners. Russia signed a memorandum of understanding with China on the ILRS in 2021. Pakistan, Azerbaijan, Belarus, South Africa, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Egypt, and Thailand have all signed cooperation agreements or expressed formal interest. The ILRS is being positioned as the alternative to the American-led Artemis program, the choice for nations that want a role in lunar development but are not part of the US-aligned framework. Lunar signals the scope, not a Mars program, not an asteroid program. The Moon the near term, achievable, strategically critical first step. Research signals legitimacy, scientific exploration, data collection, the vocabulary of the Outer Space Treaty framework that governs space activity and that all major spacefaring nations have signed. Station signals permanence, not a visit, not an expedition. A station infrastructure that remains, that accumulates capability, that is designed to be there indefinitely. The architecture of the ILRS, as described in Chinese government documents and in peer-reviewed papers published by Chinese space scientists over the past several years, has 3 phases. Phase 1, currently underway, involves robotic precursor missions to characterize the South Pole environment in detail and begin the construction of basic infrastructure. China's Chang'e 6 mission, launched in May 2024, successfully returned samples from the lunar far side, the first mission in history to do so, demonstrating the orbital mechanics capability required to operate complex multi-vehicle missions in lunar space. Chang'e 7, planned for 2026, will conduct a detailed survey of permanently shadowed regions at the South Pole, mapping water ice deposits from orbit and deploying a lander-hopper combination capable of entering shadowed craters to confirm ice presence and concentration directly. Chang'e 8, planned for approximately 2028, is the mission that transitions the program from exploration to construction. Its payload includes a technology demonstration of in-situ resource utilization, extraction, and processing of lunar materials into usable products, including potentially water and construction materials. Chang'e 8 is the bridge between reconnaissance and development. Phase 2, targeted for the early 2030s, involves the establishment of the core ILRS infrastructure, a nuclear-powered central station capable of supporting a small rotating crew with robotic construction systems that use processed lunar regolith to fabricate additional structural components. The nuclear power system is not incidental to this phase. It is the enabling technology. Unlike solar power, which is interrupted at all lunar locations by the 2-week-long lunar night, a nuclear fission reactor provides continuous power for life support, for water ice extraction and electrolysis, for robotic construction operations, for communication systems, and for whatever additional capabilities the base eventually hosts. Phase 3, targeting the late 2030s and beyond, involves expanding the core installation into a fully operational research and resource utilization facility, potentially including propellant production, extended crew rotations, and the establishment of the South Pole infrastructure as a node in a broader cislunar transportation network. This is the plan as publicly described. It is ambitious. It is technically credible. Each phase builds on demonstrated capabilities rather than requiring simultaneous breakthroughs in multiple disciplines. And it is, in its timeline and its scope, directly competitive with NASA's Artemis program in ways that the diplomatic language surrounding both programs carefully avoids acknowledging directly. The most technically significant and the least publicly discussed element of China's lunar base plan is the power system. Nuclear fission power on the moon. Not nuclear propulsion. Not radioisotope thermoelectric generators of the kind that power Voyager and Cassini and the Curiosity rover, small passive devices that convert the heat of radioactive decay into modest amounts of electricity. Actual fission reactors control chain reaction systems that split uranium or plutonium nuclei to generate heat, which is then converted to electricity through thermoelectric or Stirling cycle systems. China confirmed in 2022 that the ILRS power system will be nuclear fission-based. The specific system being developed described in Chinese aerospace engineering publications as a 10 kilowatt class fission reactor for initial deployment. Scalable to higher power levels would provide continuous power output, sufficient to run a full life support system, water electrolysis, robotic construction equipment, and communication arrays simultaneously, independent of solar cycles or lunar night. The United States is pursuing the same technology. NASA's Fission Surface Power Project, developed in partnership with the Department of Energy, completed a competitive contract award in 2022 for the design of a 10 kilowatt class fission reactor system targeted for demonstration on the Moon by the end of the decade. The technical requirements align closely with the Chinese system, suggesting both programs have independently converged on similar engineering solutions to the same fundamental power challenge. The significance of nuclear fission power on the Moon goes beyond energy independence from the solar cycle. A 10 kilowatt system is a starting point. The scaling mathematics of nuclear fission are favorable in a way that solar power scaling is not. Doubling a solar array roughly doubles its power output and exactly doubles its mass and area. Scaling a fission reactor from 10 kilowatts to 100 kilowatts requires engineering modifications and additional shielding, but does not require 10 times the physical footprint. Nuclear power scales efficiently, and a base that begins with 10 kilowatts of continuous power and scales to hundreds of kilowatts is a base that can support progressively more ambitious operations without proportional increases in infrastructure mass. Hundreds of kilowatts of continuous power on the lunar surface is sufficient to run industrial-scale water ice extraction and electrolysis. It is sufficient to power the robotic fabrication systems that would use lunar regolith as feedstock for structural components. It is sufficient to support a crew of meaningful size, not the 2 to 4 person rotations of an early outpost, but a larger, more capable permanent population. The nuclear power decision is the decision that reveals the long-term ambition of the program more clearly than any other single technical choice. A program planning a temporary scientific outpost uses solar power, less complex, less politically sensitive, adequate for modest energy needs. A program planning a permanent industrial facility with indefinite growth potential uses nuclear fission. The power system choice is a statement of intent that the diplomatic language surrounding the ILRS obscures but does not conceal. There is also a military dimension to nuclear power on the Moon that the arms control community has begun discussing with increasing urgency. The Outer Space Treaty of 1967 prohibits the placement of nuclear weapons on the Moon or in orbit. It does not prohibit nuclear power systems for peaceful purposes. Nuclear-powered civilian spacecraft and reactors have been operated in space by both the United States and the Soviet Union since the 1960s. The distinction between a nuclear power reactor and a nuclear weapons system is clear in principle and somewhat less clear in practice when the reactor is embedded in a military-relevant installation. China's military and civilian space programs have a degree of integration that makes the distinction between civilian lunar infrastructure and dual-use strategic capability genuinely ambiguous. The People's Liberation Army Strategic Support Force oversees Chinese space operations. The ILRS is described as a civilian scientific program. The organizational relationship between the two means that the capabilities developed for the ILRS autonomous robotic systems, nuclear power, resource extraction, crewed deep space operations are simultaneously capabilities that expand the PLA's strategic reach beyond Earth. This is not unique to China. NASA's Artemis program involves coordination with the Department of Defense, and the strategic dimensions of American lunar activity are clearly understood within US national security planning. But the opacity of the Chinese program, the degree to which the details of specific capabilities, timelines, and operational concepts are not disclosed publicly, makes assessment of its dual-use potential substantially more uncertain. What is certain is that a permanent nuclear-powered installation at the lunar South Pole, operated by a nation with an integrated civil-military space program, represents a strategic asset of a kind that the existing international space law framework was not designed to address. The document governing human activity in outer space is the Treaty on Principles governing the activities of states in the exploration and use of outer space, including the Moon and other celestial bodies, universally known as the Outer Space Treaty. It was signed in 1967 at the height of the Cold War, when the United States and the Soviet Union were racing to demonstrate supremacy through space achievement, and both sides recognized that an uncontrolled extension of Cold War competition into the space domain could be catastrophically destabilizing. The Outer Space Treaty established several foundational principles. Space is the province of all mankind. No nation can claim sovereignty over any celestial body or any portion of it. Activities in outer space must be conducted for the benefit of all countries. Nations are responsible for the activities of their nationals in space, including private actors. Nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction are prohibited in space. The Moon and other celestial bodies shall be used exclusively for peaceful purposes. These principles were appropriate to 1967. They were designed for an era when space activity was conducted exclusively by governments, when the only space programs of significance were American and Soviet, and when the primary concern was preventing nuclear weapons from being placed in orbit or on the Moon. They were not designed for an era when multiple nations and dozens of private companies are actively planning commercial resource extraction from celestial bodies. They were not designed for an era when permanent crewed installations on the Moon are transitioning from aspiration to near-term planning reality. They were not designed to answer the question of whether a nation can establish a permanent base on the Moon, extract resources from it, exclude other actors from its vicinity for safety reasons, and retain control of the extracted resources without technically claiming sovereignty. This is precisely the legal vacuum that both the United States and China are currently navigating. The United States addressed it in 2015 by passing the Commercial Space Launch Competitiveness Act, which explicitly grants American citizens the right to own and sell resources extracted from celestial bodies, asserting that resource extraction rights do not constitute territorial sovereignty claims and are therefore permissible under the Outer Space Treaty. In 2020, the Trump administration issued an executive order reaffirming this interpretation and explicitly rejecting the Moon Agreement of 1979, a subsequent international treaty that would have established a common heritage of mankind regime for lunar resources which the United States Russia and China have all declined to ratify. The Artemis Accords, developed by NASA and the State Department beginning in 2020, establish a multilateral framework for lunar activity built around the US. Interpretation resource extraction rights are permissible. Safety zones around operations are appropriate. Transparency and interoperability are required. 14 nations have signed. China has not. Russia has not. China's legal position on lunar resources is formally ambiguous. Beijing has not publicly staked out a specific legal interpretation, but its operational approach is consistent with a position that China will do what its program requires and will manage the legal characterization afterward. This is not unusual in international law. Nations routinely act first and interpret legal frameworks to accommodate their actions second, particularly when the relevant law is genuinely ambiguous. The relevant ambiguity here is profound. The Outer Space Treaty prohibits national sovereignty claims. It does not prohibit permanent installations. It does not prohibit resource extraction, a point on which international legal scholars have disagreed for decades. It does not define what constitutes a sovereignty claim in operational terms, whether establishing a base that functionally controls access to a resource-rich area constitutes a prohibited claim even without a formal declaration. What is clear is that a permanent, nuclear-powered, resource-extracting installation at the lunar South Pole, established by any nation, will create facts on the ground that the existing legal framework was never designed to adjudicate. The nation that establishes that installation first will have a practical advantage in any subsequent negotiation over access and resource rights that no amount of subsequent legal argument will fully offset. First presence is not sovereignty, but it is not nothing either. The credibility of China's lunar base plan rests not on ambition is cheap, but on the demonstrated capabilities of a space program that has, over the past 15 years, executed an astonishing sequence of increasingly complex missions, with a success rate that the global space community has had to acknowledge with a mixture of admiration and concern. Consider the trajectory. Chang'e 1, launched in 2007, was China's first lunar mission, a simple orbital mapper that confirmed basic orbital mechanics capability for lunar distances. Chang'e 2, launched in 2010, went into a lower, higher resolution orbit and subsequently departed to visit an asteroid, demonstrating deep space navigation beyond the Moon. Chang'e 3, launched in 2013, landed the first spacecraft on the Moon since the Soviet Lunar 24 mission in 1976, deploying the U-2 rover in a soft landing that worked on the first attempt. Chang'e 4, launched in 2018, landed on the far side of the Moon, the hemisphere permanently facing away from Earth, a feat that had never been accomplished by any nation. Landing on the far side requires a relay satellite in a halo orbit around the Earth-Moon L2 Lagrange point to maintain communication, because the Moon's own bulk blocks direct radio contact with Earth from the far side surface. China designed, built, launched, and successfully operated both the relay satellite and the lander rover combination, completing an extraordinarily complex multi-vehicle mission that no other space agency had attempted. Chang'e 5, launched in 2020, collected 1.7 kilograms of lunar samples from the near side and returned them to Earth, making China only the third nation to return lunar samples after the United States and the Soviet Union. The sample return mission required a lunar ascent vehicle, orbital rendezvous in lunar orbit, and re-entry capsule recovery on Earth, 4 distinct complex mission phases, all executed successfully. Chang'e 6, launched in May 2024, collected samples from the far side of the Moon and returned them to Earth again, the first mission in history to do so, requiring the far side relay satellite infrastructure established by Chang'e 4 and demonstrating that China can operate complex sample return missions from the lunar far side as reliably as from the near side. This sequence is not incremental progress toward an uncertain goal. It is a systematic, carefully staged capability development program, each mission testing and validating the specific systems required for the next phase: landing, roving, far-side operations. 2. Sample collection, ascent vehicle, orbital rendezvous, sample return, each capability demonstrated before the next is attempted, each success enabling the next step. The program has had failures. The U-2 rover on Chang'e 4 experienced anomalies. Various instruments have underperformed. No space program operates without problems. But the mission-level success rate, the rate at which major mission objectives have been achieved, is exceptional. And the progression from simple to complex, from near to far, from robotic to infrastructure building, follows a logic that leads directly to the South Pole base. Chang'e 7, targeting the South Pole for a survey mission, and Chang'e 8, targeting South Pole resource utilization demonstration, are not speculative future projects. They are the next planned steps in a program that has executed every previous planned step. The question is not whether China can do this. The question is what happens when it does. One of the most technically ambitious elements of the ILRS plan, and one of the least discussed in Western media coverage, is the robotic construction capability that China is developing to build the base without requiring a large initial crewed presence. Building a permanent habitat on the moon is not simply an engineering problem of the kind solved by conventional construction. It is a materials science problem, a logistics problem, a radiation shielding problem, and an in-situ resource utilization problem all simultaneously, in an environment where every kilogram of material shipped from Earth costs thousands of dollars in launch mass. The Chinese approach, described in peer-reviewed papers from Chinese aerospace institutions, centers on a technology called 3D printing with lunar regolith, using the moon's own surface material as feedstock for automated fabrication of structural components. Lunar regolith, the pulverized rock and dust covering the lunar surface, is primarily composed of silicates, oxides, and minerals that, when melted and resolidified, form materials with structural properties adequate for radiation-shielded habitat walls. The feedstock is literally everywhere. The moon's surface is covered with meters of it, the accumulated product of 4 billion years of micrometeorite bombardment. The concept is not new. NASA and European Space Agency researchers have been developing lunar 3D printing concepts for over a decade. The European Space Agency's Lunar project, in partnership with the architectural firm Foster Plus Partners, demonstrated in 2013 that a building dome adequate for lunar habitat construction could be printed from a simulated lunar regolith using a large-scale 3D printing system. The printed structure achieved sufficient compressive strength for structural use and provided meaningful radiation shielding through its bulk. What China is developing is the operational implementation, autonomous robotic systems capable of operating the printing process, without continuous human supervision, in a radiation environment and temperature range that makes human EVA impractical for sustained construction work, at the scale required to build habitable volumes rather than demonstration samples. The scale of robotic construction required to build the ILRS core station is significant. A habitat providing adequate radiation shielding for long-term human occupation requires walls with an effective thickness equivalent to several meters of regolith, either actual regolith piled over a pressure vessel or a printed regolith shell of sufficient thickness. The total mass of printed material for even a modest initial habitat module runs to hundreds of tons. Printing hundreds of tons of lunar material requires sustained robotic operation over periods of months to years. This is achievable with the nuclear power system that provides continuous electrical energy to the printing equipment independent of the solar cycle. It is achievable with the autonomous control systems that China has been developing for its rover programs, systems capable of operating with significant time delays in communication and without real-time human control for extended periods. And it is achievable in the specific environmental conditions of the South Pole, where the crater rims in continuous sunlight are accessible to solar-powered rovers for survey and material transport, while the nuclear-powered printing systems operate in the crater interiors. The combination of nuclear power, robotic fabrication, and in-situ resource utilization creates a construction paradigm that is genuinely different from the Apollo-era approach of shipping everything from Earth. It is a paradigm that, once established, has the potential to scale because the primary input, lunar regolith, is unlimited at the site, and the energy input, from the nuclear reactor, is continuous. A base that can build itself using local materials, powered by a local nuclear reactor, operated by autonomous robotic systems, with a human crew arriving to a completed structure rather than building it under hazardous conditions, This is the architecture of a permanent installation, not a temporary outpost. The United States is not unaware of what China is doing. The American response, the Artemis program, is the most ambitious human spaceflight initiative since Apollo, and it is explicitly framed by NASA Administrator Bill Nelson and by senior Defense Department officials as a strategic competition with China as much as a scientific exploration program. Nelson has said publicly, on multiple occasions, that the United States is in a race with China to return humans to the moon. He has warned that China could attempt to exclude the United States from favourable South Pole landing sites by establishing prior presence and declaring safety exclusion zones around its infrastructure. He has described the lunar South Pole water ice deposits as a potential source of geopolitical tension analogous to territorial disputes over maritime resources on Earth. These are not the statements of a scientist talking about exploration. They are the statements of a national security official talking about strategic competition. The Artemis program's architecture is built around the Space Launch System, a heavy-lift rocket capable of sending the Orion crewed capsule to lunar orbit, the Lunar Gateway, a small space station in a near rectilinear halo orbit around the Moon that serves as a staging point for lunar surface missions, and the Human Landing System, the lander that carries crew from Gateway to the surface and back. SpaceX's Starship has been selected as the initial human landing system, a choice that adds the formidable technical capabilities of SpaceX's rapidly developing rocket program to the Artemis architecture. The Artemis 1 mission, an uncrewed test of the Space Launch System and Orion capsule, flew successfully in November 2022. Artemis 2, the first crewed test of the system, was originally targeted for late 2024, but has slipped to 2025. Artemis 3, the first crewed landing on the lunar surface targeting the South Pole, is currently targeted for 2026, though schedule slippage in both the Space Launch System and the Starship Human Landing System has made this date increasingly uncertain. Meanwhile, China has publicly stated a target of landing Chinese taikonauts on the Moon by 2030. The specific mission architecture, the Long March 10 heavy-lift rocket, the Mengzhou crewed spacecraft, the Lanyu lander has been publicly described with engineering specifics consistent with genuine development programs rather than aspirational announcements. Whether the 2030 target is achievable depends on a development program that, to date, has met its targets more consistently than most Western observers initially credited. The convergence of timelines is the detail that makes the competitive dimension of the situation most acute. If the United States lands at the South Pole in 2026 and China lands at the South Pole in 2030, the 4-year head start allows the establishment of infrastructure, the beginning of resource extraction operations, and the creation of facts on the ground that will shape every subsequent negotiation about access and rights at the South Pole. If the timelines converge, if Artemis slips and the Chinese program accelerates, or if both arrive within the same year, the question of who establishes what, where, and what legal and practical significance that establishment carries becomes immediate and urgent in a way that 4 years of clear American priority would diffuse. This is why the scheduled discussions around both programs are not merely engineering conversations. They are strategic assessments. The lunar South Pole, from a military perspective, has a characteristic that strategic planners in every major spacefaring nation have noted, and none has yet said clearly in public. It is the highest ground available. Military doctrine, from the earliest recorded warfare to the present day, has recognized the strategic value of elevation. High ground provides observation advantages, potential energy advantages for weapons systems, and defensible positions that require significantly more effort to assault than to hold. The concept extends directly into space orbital mechanics, means that spacecraft at higher orbits have energy advantages over those at lower orbits, and the Moon, as the most elevated body accessible from Earth, represents the ultimate high ground in the Earth-Moon system. This is not a new observation. During the Apollo era, defense analysts in both the United States and the Soviet Union considered the strategic implications of lunar basing. The decision to include the Moon specifically in the Outer Space Treaty's prohibition on military installations was driven by the recognition that the strategic implications of armed lunar bases were destabilizing in ways that needed to be precluded before they became operational realities. The Outer Space Treaty prohibits military bases on the Moon and the placement of weapons of mass destruction. It does not prohibit military personnel from conducting research on the Moon. It does not prohibit dual-use infrastructure. It does not define with precision the line between a civilian scientific installation with military applications and a military installation. A nuclear-powered installation at the lunar South Pole with resource extraction capabilities, robotic construction systems, and a persistent crewed presence is, regardless of its formal classification, a strategic asset of the First Order. It provides continuous observation of cislunar space. It provides a potential refueling point for spacecraft operating in the Earth-Moon system. It provides a location from which, in a hypothetical future conflict, assets could be deployed with the energy advantages of the Moon's elevated position. None of this requires the installation to be formally military. The capabilities are inherent in the civilian infrastructure. The dual-use potential is a function of what the installation can do, not of the organizational chart of the agency that operates it. Both the United States and China are building this kind of installation. Both are doing so within the framework of declared civilian scientific programs. Both understand the strategic dimensions of what they are building. Neither is publicly acknowledging the full extent of those dimensions. The difference is transparency. NASA's budget, its contracts, its technical documentation, and its mission planning are subject to congressional oversight and significant public disclosure. The CNSA's equivalent processes are not. The degree to which the ILRS incorporates capabilities beyond its declared civilian scientific scope is not accessible from publicly available information, which is itself a strategic fact. Ambiguity is a resource. A program whose capabilities are not fully visible to potential competitors creates an information advantage that the competitor must respond to by assuming the worst-case scenario. The US Space Force, established in 2019, has been explicit that cislunar space, the volume between Earth and the Moon, is a domain that requires active military awareness and, potentially, active military presence. The Space Force's Cislunar Awareness Program is developing the sensor systems and operational concepts for monitoring and characterizing activity in the Earth-Moon system. The recognition that the Moon and cislunar space are strategically significant domains is now formally embedded in US military doctrine. Whether this military awareness translates into actual military capability at the lunar South Pole, whether the Artemis base will have a formal or informal relationship with the US Space Force, analogous to the relationship between Antarctic research stations and the US military, is a question that has not been publicly resolved. What has been resolved is that both major programs targeting the lunar South Pole are being developed by nations that understand the strategic as well as scientific significance of what they are doing, and that the legal framework governing their activities was designed for a different era with different capabilities and different competitive dynamics. The water ice at the lunar South Pole is the resource that makes everything else possible, but it is not the only resource at the galactic center that both programs have their eyes on. Helium-3. The Moon's surface has been exposed to the solar wind, the constant stream of charged particles flowing outward from the Sun for 4 billion years. The solar wind contains helium-3, a rare isotope of helium with 2 protons and 1 neutron, in proportions that are negligible on Earth, but that have accumulated in the lunar regolith over geological time to concentrations that make the Moon potentially the most accessible source of helium, 3 inches the inner solar system. Helium-3 is of interest as a fusion fuel. The reaction of helium-3 with deuterium, a heavy isotope of hydrogen, produces energy through fusion with the specific advantage that the primary reaction products are protons rather than neutrons. A proton-producing fusion reaction is far easier to shield against and has fewer material activation concerns than the neutron-producing reactions of conventional deuterium-tritium fusion. Helium-3 fusion is theoretically one of the cleanest and most efficient fusion reactions possible. The caveat is that helium-3 fusion has not been demonstrated at any scale. The temperatures and confinement conditions required to ignite the reaction exceed what current fusion research programs are targeting. Helium-3 fusion is a second-generation fusion technology, dependent on the success of first-generation deuterium-tritium fusion, that is itself still in the research and demonstration phase. But if fusion energy is eventually realized and the pace of progress in fusion research, while historically slower than optimists have predicted, has accelerated meaningfully in the past decade, helium-3 becomes a strategically critical resource. The reserves on Earth are measured in kilograms, produced as a byproduct of tritium decay in nuclear weapons programs. The reserves on the Moon are measured in millions of tons, distributed across the regolith in concentrations that, while low by terrestrial mining standards, are accessible by automated extraction systems operating on a large scale. China has been explicit about helium-3 as a long-term motivation for lunar development. Chinese scientists have published extensively on helium-3 extraction from lunar regolith, on the potential scale of lunar helium-3 reserves, and on the relationship between lunar resource development and long-term energy security. The combination of helium-3 potential and water ice creates a resource argument for lunar development that goes well beyond scientific exploration. Rare earth elements are also present on the Moon in concentrations that are geologically significant, though the economics of returning rare earth elements from the Moon to Earth, given current launch costs, are not currently competitive with terrestrial extraction. As launch costs fall and lunar infrastructure develops, the calculus changes. The rare earth deposits in Lunar Maria, the dark basaltic plains visible on the Moon's near side, represent a resource that, in a sufficiently advanced space economy, would have real commercial value. The legal status of these resources is the same ambiguous territory as the water ice. The US interpretation resource extraction does not equal sovereignty. Claim is one position. The common heritage of mankind interpretation lunar resources belong to all of humanity and cannot be appropriated by any single nation is another. The practical reality is that whichever nation operates the extraction equipment controls the extracted resources, regardless of the legal theory applied to characterize that control. The resource dimension of the South Pole competition is not merely an economic consideration. It is a long-term strategic consideration about who shapes the rules of the emerging space economy, while those rules are still being written. China's decision to brand its lunar program as the International Lunar Research Station, rather than a Chinese lunar base, is a strategic communication choice with real implications. By positioning the ILRS as an international program and actively recruiting partner nations, China is doing several things simultaneously. It is creating a coalition of nations with stakes in the program's success, nations whose participation in the ILRS represents a diplomatic alignment choice that affects their relationship with the competing Artemis coalition. A nation that has signed an ILRS cooperation agreement and a nation that has signed the Artemis Accords are positioned differently in the geopolitics of cislunar development. The ILRS partner list is partly a map of nations that have chosen, for whatever combination of scientific, economic, and political reasons, not to align with the US-led framework. It is building the institutional infrastructure for resource sharing and data sharing arrangements that will govern operations on the Moon arrangements that are being established now, before the facilities exist, while the legal and normative frameworks are still being shaped. A nation that participates in the ILRS from the beginning is part of the conversations that define what the ILRS is for, how it operates, and what rights its participants have. A nation that arrives later must accept arrangements made without it. It is creating political pressure on the Artemis framework by demonstrating that there is a viable alternative. The Artemis Accords have been signed by 14 nations, a meaningful coalition but one that excludes most of the developing world, Russia and China. The ILRS partnership list includes nations from Africa, Latin America, the Middle East and Asia that have not joined Artemis. The competition for partners is partly a competition to establish which framework becomes the dominant governance model for cislunar activity. The pressure this creates on the United States is multi-level. Strategically, a large ILRS coalition reduces American influence over the norms that will govern lunar operations. Diplomatically, it creates relationships that complicate other areas of bilateral and multilateral engagement. Technically, it creates a competing capability development program that may reach operational milestones on timelines competitive with Artemis. The response from the United States and its Artemis partners has been to expand the Accords to recruit additional signatory nations, to engage with nations that have expressed interest in multiple frameworks, and to accelerate the technical development of the capabilities that will make the Artemis Coalition's presence on the Moon a reality rather than a promise. Whether this response is sufficient, whether the Artemis coalition reaches the South Pole first, establishes functional infrastructure, and creates the facts on the ground that make its governance framework the de facto standard depends on execution. On whether SLS flies on schedule, whether Starship is qualified for crewed lunar missions, whether the Lunar Gateway is built on the timeline that the current program assumes. The execution track record of the Artemis program is mixed. SLS flew but late. Artemis 2 has slipped. The Gateway faces funding uncertainties and congressional budget cycles. The human landing system development is progressing but against a demanding schedule that has already experienced compression from the original targets. China's program has slipped too. Its original 2028 crewed landing target has moved to 2030. But China's program has slipped less than most Western observers initially predicted, and each subsequent mission has performed at or above expectations. The race is real. The outcome is not determined. 75 nations have signed the Outer Space Treaty. The treaty has governed space activity for nearly 60 years and has achieved something remarkable. Space has remained largely a domain of competition without direct military conflict. No weapons of mass destruction have been placed in orbit. No nation has formally claimed sovereignty over any celestial body. The broad principles of the treaty have held even as the specific capabilities it contemplated have been dramatically exceeded by subsequent technological development. But the treaty's success at preventing the worst-case scenarios of its era has not equipped it to govern the scenarios of the emerging era. Its language on resource extraction is ambiguous. Its definition of peaceful purposes is undefined. Its silence on permanent crewed installations, its failure to specify any rules for what nations can do on the moon, beyond prohibiting weapons and sovereignty claims, leaves the most practically important questions unanswered. The international community has been trying with limited success to fill this governance vacuum. The Moon Agreement of 1979, negotiated within the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, would have established a common heritage of mankind regime for lunar resources requiring international authorization for extraction activities and international sharing of extracted resources. It has been ratified by 18 nations, none of which are among the major spacefaring powers. The United States, Russia, China, the European Union member states in their individual capacities, India, Japan, none have ratified it. The Moon Agreement is technically binding international law for its 18 signatories and irrelevant to the nations actually developing lunar capabilities. The Artemis Accords represent a different approach, a bilateral agreement between the United States and individual partner nations, establishing norms for lunar activity within a framework that the United States interprets as consistent with the Outer Space Treaty. The Accords establish that resource extraction is permissible, that safety zones around operations are appropriate, that transparency is required, and that interoperability of rescue systems is expected. They are legally significant for their signatories and non-binding for non-signatories, including China and Russia. What does not exist is a multilateral governance framework that includes all major spacefaring powers and addresses the specific questions that permanent lunar installations will raise. What is the process for establishing safety zones, and how large can they be? What rights do nations have over resources extracted from locations where they have established infrastructure? How is access to the South Pole managed when multiple parties have installations in the same resource-rich area? What mechanisms exist for resolving disputes? These questions will be answered. The answer will either be a negotiated multilateral framework that all major powers accept, or it will be facts on the ground, operational realities established by the programs that arrive first and operate longest, around which subsequent negotiations must work. The window for negotiating a comprehensive framework before operational realities take over is closing. Both programs are past the planning phase. Infrastructure decisions are being made now. Decisions about power systems, about habitat locations, about resource extraction equipment that will shape the physical facts on the ground for decades. The international community's ability to establish governance frameworks that precede rather than react to physical infrastructure on the moon is directly proportional to how quickly diplomats can work relative to how quickly engineers can build. The historical record of that competition is not encouraging for the diplomats. The next decade, 2025 to 2035, will determine the structure of human lunar activity for the rest of this century. Not because the decisions made in this decade will be permanent, but because the first permanent installations at the South Pole will create institutional, legal, and physical realities that subsequent decisions must accommodate rather than design freely. The most likely scenario, based on current program trajectories, is that the United States and its Artemis partners establish the first human presence at the South Pole sometime in the mid to late 2020s. American crewed missions, combined with the development of commercial lunar delivery services under NASA's Commercial Lunar Payload Services program, begin building the infrastructure of an Artemis base camp. The Lunar Gateway enters service in the early 2030s as a staging point. Resource extraction begins at modest scale. The South Pole becomes a site of ongoing American and Allied activity. China establishes a crewed lunar presence by 2030 or shortly thereafter. ILRS partner nations contribute to the construction and operation of robotic infrastructure preceding the crewed mission. The ILRS core station begins construction using in-situ resource utilization techniques in the early 2030s. Nuclear power is operational. Water ice extraction begins. Both installations exist simultaneously at the South Pole. They are separated by some distance. The specific geography of South Pole crater rims and permanently shadowed regions creates a natural structure of discrete locations, but they are close enough to the same resource zone that access and rights questions become concrete rather than hypothetical. The interaction between the two programs at this point will be the defining event in the governance of cislunar space. It will either be managed through diplomatic and legal frameworks established in advance through expanded multilateral engagement, through the development of a governance regime that both the Artemis Coalition and the ILRS partnership accept, or it will be managed through the same mechanism that has governed territorial disputes throughout human history. Presence, persistence, and the practical reality of who is operating what, where, and with what capability to maintain that operation against challenge. This is not a comforting conclusion, it is an honest one. The Moon is not inherently a place of conflict. The scientific case for international cooperation on lunar research is overwhelming the questions that the Moon can answer about the history of the solar system, the origins of Earth, and the potential for life elsewhere are questions that benefit from the combined capabilities of the entire international scientific community rather than any subset of it. The practical case for cooperation is also strong. The logistics of South Pole operations, the sharing of emergency resources, the joint management of a fragile surface environment all favor coordination over competition. But cooperation requires governance. Governance requires agreement. Agreement requires engagement between parties who have chosen, to date, to operate in parallel rather than in partnership. The United States and China are not cooperating in human spaceflight. The Wolf Amendment, a provision of US law that prohibits NASA from bilateral engagement with China without explicit congressional approval, effectively prohibits the kind of technical coordination that would be necessary for genuine cooperative lunar operations. The diplomatic architecture for managing two major, permanent, militarily relevant installations at the lunar South Pole does not yet exist. Building it will require political will, legal creativity, and the recognition by both sides that an unmanaged competition for the Moon's strategic resources carries risks that neither side has fully priced. What China is building on the Moon is ambitious, technically credible, strategically significant, and legally ambiguous in ways that the existing international framework cannot cleanly resolve. What the United States and its partners are building is the same ambitious, credible, significant, and ambiguous. The question is not which program builds more or builds faster. The question is whether two great powers, competing for the first time for permanent presence on another world, can develop the diplomatic infrastructure to manage that competition without the South Pole of the Moon becoming the first extraterrestrial location where the worst tendencies of human territorial behavior are given permanent physical expression. For most of human history, the Moon was a light in the sky, a rhythm, a calendar, a companion to the darkness that told farmers when to plant, and navigators where to steer, and poets what to write about longing and distance and the passage of time. It was close enough to see in detail with the naked eye the Maria, the Highlands, The shadows at the terminator and distant enough to be unreachable for all but the last 55 years of our species' history. A presence that shaped human culture, biology, and language without ever being a place, something you looked at rather than something you went to. We went to it. In 1969, 12 human beings walked on its surface across 6 missions, brought back 842 pounds of rock, planted flags that are now bleached white by decades of ultraviolet exposure, and left behind equipment that still sits in the dust of the Sea of Tranquility and the Ocean of Storms and the Fra Mauro Highlands, undisturbed since the last lunar module ascent stage lifted off the surface in December 1972. For 52 years after that, the moon was again a place we looked at rather than a place we went to. The flags were there, the equipment was there, the footprints were there, preserved in the airless vacuum, immune to wind or rain, potentially permanent for millions of years in the absence of any erosive force. And then, in the 2020s, we went back. Not in the same way. Not with the Cold War urgency of the Apollo era, funded by the existential competitive pressure of superpower rivalry and executed by a generation of engineers and astronauts who understood what was at stake. This time with more nations, more programs, more commercial actors, more technical capability, and the same territorial instincts, the same competitive drives, the same tendency to project the conflicts of Earth onto any new territory that becomes accessible. What China is building on the moon is a reflection of what China is: an ambitious, rapidly developing, strategically self-aware civilization that has decided space is a domain in which it will not accept a subordinate position and has committed the resources to ensure it does not. What the United States and its partners are building is a reflection of what they are: an established, threatened, still capable leading power, and its coalition defending a position of primacy in a domain where the rules are being rewritten in real time. The moon itself is indifferent to all of this. It has been there for 4.5 billion years and will be there for billions more. It has seen the formation of oceans and the extinction of species and the rise and fall of every civilization that has ever existed on the planet it orbits. Whatever humanity builds on its surface in the coming decades will be, on geological timescales, the briefest possible inscription on the oldest readable surface in the inner solar system. But the decisions made in those coming decades will shape what kind of species makes those inscriptions. Whether the first permanent human presence on another world embodies the cooperative, scientific, humanity-serving principles that the Outer Space Treaty aspired to, or whether it embodies the territorial, competitive, resource-maximizing principles that have governed human expansion across every previous frontier. The moon is watching. It has been watching for 4.5 billion years. And what we build there, and how we build it, and whether we build it together or against each other, that will be the first permanent answer we have ever given to the question of what we are when we are finally somewhere else. The answer is being written now.